CEOs set direction. So they have to be able to create a vision, and from that, a strategy. And the vision has to be inspiring to the people in their teams.
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Executives, the show where we navigate in the intricate world of executive leadership, exploring strategies, insights, and personal stories of successful professionals shaping the global business landscape. I'm your host, Majid, and joining us today is Dr. Elizabeth Coffey. Liz is an internationally recognized trusted advisor, lecturer, and author who has developed CEOs, vice chancellors, and executives from global 500 companies. With extensive experience as a senior partner at Coffey and senior roles at Mercer Delta Consulting, she has coached elite leaders and their teams across industries in over 40 countries. She is a master trainer in strategic influencing, trained by Dr. Joel DeLuca. Liz has taught thousands worldwide in ethical leadership. She has authored several leadership books and received numerous awards, including an honorary doctorate and international leadership awards. Liz has also led immersive leadership trips to India, produced a full-length documentary on Indian rock music, and continues to work with global clients such as Goldman Sachs, LinkedIn, Shell, and the UK Senior Civil Service. Hello and welcome to the podcast, Elizabeth.
Good morning.
Good morning. One thing I have to ask you before I ask you about introduction is, have you read all the books behind you?
Yeah, there's a lot. I am, the short answer is no. I am at a friend's library and he has read all of them. I asked him this last night and he told me he read all of them. If we were in my library, yes, most of them I would have read, but I have to honestly, hand on heart, say I've probably read 5% of what he's got. He's a smart guy.
Nice. What was the last book you read?
Oh, gosh. You know, I read so much for work. That's like reports and stuff like that. It's even hard to remember. But I would say I read a book by Tahir Shah called The Caliph's House, which is about a one-year project to take a kind of dilapidated house in Casablanca and to redo it with local artisans. That was a massive bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. So that was fantastic. And written by a friend, so even more fantastic.
I need to read it.
Yeah.
I will probably read it. But so I tried to do justice because you have a lot of experience. When I was reading through your profile, I was struggling. What should I mention and what should I not mention? So can you tell us more about who is Liz?
Yes. Well, I'll kind of give you a sweep of kind of where I started in doing this work and kind of where I am now very briefly. But most people who go into leadership consulting work or leadership coaching work have started out doing something else and become executives in another area and then switch. And I am not like that. I really have had, I would say, vocational to do this. And I had training, whether wanted or not, by my parents as a child. So one of the things is that my father was a professor of philosophy and he specialized in the Greek philosophers. So he would teach us at breakfast, lunch, and dinner the courses he was teaching undergraduate or sometimes even graduate stuff. And, you know, if we wanted to hear it or if we didn't want to hear it, that didn't matter. He was going to tell us. So we learned Socratic method of questioning when I was around 8, I would say. And that's really these days seen as the purest form of coaching. So I kind of had that core skill as a child and it became kind of part of my DNA. And I was always somebody that other people went to solve their problems. And then I had something happen which made me very focused on leadership, which was that my mother got ill, very ill when I was 6 and my brother was 9. We were the eldest of 4. And she basically told us that we had to do her job in the family. And if we didn't do a good enough job, that she'd have to get up out of her sick bed and correct our mistakes, which the doctors had told her would kill her. So we had high pressure to be very young leaders in the family. And so I was a leader kind of by accident in a way, and also a carer for, you know, an elder, which was, they didn't really have phrasing for that in those days. But that made me really curious about leaders because I was doing a leadership job. And So I would always be fascinated by leaders and go ask them what they were doing. And sometimes we would have situations where we would be on holiday. And I remember one time we were on a large ferry on summer holiday, and according to my family, I got lost. They couldn't find me. And they immediately thought, where's the leader? Meaning, in this case, the captain. And they went up to the captain's deck, and that's where I was, of course, asking questions about, how do you steer the ship and how do you run? So I've always kind of had a fascination for it and always had to do it, if you will. So I started to work about 25 years ago with CEOs of FTSE 100s, board members at that kind of level. And about around the same time, a couple of years later, started to write books. So I've written 3 books on leadership. The second one was about developing chief executives, called 10 Things That Keep CEOs Awake, published by McGraw-Hill Business Books. And that book, I suppose, established an expertise for me in the field of developing CEOs and their successors. And about 60% of my clients now are CEOs, and pretty much all of my work comes through personal recommendations.
Cool. When I was looking at your client list, I was like, I saw all the big names, all of the big names, talk from governments to media to hospitals to education. I was like, which industry is missing? And I couldn't think of anything. Maybe celebrities, maybe that was missing, but because I was just having a discussion with one of my friends. They were asking me, Majid, who would be an ideal, like, who would you love to have on your podcast? I was like, one of these K-pop singers, because they are really inspiring. One, they are celebrities. Two, they are really powerful businesswomen, like extremely powerful. So, and I was like, they would be a good inspiration because they could also inspire younger people. So, but nevertheless, today we are sitting because I have a really fancy topic, and which is that leadership excellence, navigating CEOs, succession, and strategic influencing. And before we deep dive into the topic, I would love to understand, because you have been training CEOs, what, in your opinion, is the role of a CEO?
First, I'm going to premise this by saying there's a huge amount of research on this. So I'm borrowing. This is not kind of an original set of thoughts, but it's kind of borrowing from the research plus what I know works on the ground. The first thing is that the CEOs set direction. So they have to be able to create a vision, and from that, a strategy. And the vision has to be inspiring to the people in their teams. The second thing is that they have to role model the leadership for that company. And by that, I mean, usually companies are very thoughtful about what kind of a culture do we want to have, and what are the values of this organization, and so on. But they may not be as explicit about the fact that if the senior leaders don't do that stuff, nobody else is going to do that stuff. So you have to have people that really believe in the mission and the vision and are willing to act the way that they sort of tell other people to act, so to speak. The third thing is that McKinsey research from a few years ago showed that about 60% of a CEO's day is spent strategic influencing, and most of that is external. It's up to the board, which is not really external, but is getting closer. It's out to policymakers, out to regulators, out to the investment community, to the media, suppliers, customers, and of course are also influencing internally, usually on large strategic change initiatives. But the bulk of their work is actually focused up and out. So that is a huge, huge part of their job, which often kind of gets overlooked by a lot of people. And then the kind of final thing of 4 things that I wanted to talk about with you about this is they choose and then lead the top team. And that sounds like a simple thing to do, but it really isn't, because getting the right mix of people with the right kind of skill base, with the right kind of geographic base or kind of national culture base, with the right kind of thinking brains who all get along and function together as a high-performing team is quite a challenge. So that's a big, big piece of their job.
Interesting, because really, like, I remember the first time we had a conversation, you explained to me as well that CEO's job is not to look down at the company, but to look up, which is something you mentioned now as well. And that's a definition I've been using all across now. Everyone, whoever asks me, I'm like using this because it's a really good idea. You hired people who are experts to do the job. Like you hired really, really experienced people. Hey, deliver me this product. They know how to deliver product. But then if you keep poking them and asking them, hey, what's the status every single day, then no one is actually in contact with the investors, with so on and so forth. Even in big companies, for example, there are investor relation teams, right? So which means
Yeah.
it's a business is fundamentally really complicated. Let's talk about first, what are your actually some significant milestones or achievements in your career that have actually shaped your approach towards leadership development?
Yeah, there are a few things. One, I would say that when I started to write books, which was in 1999, it was a research book about women leaders in the UK. And I started to get asked by the people that we'd interviewed. We interviewed 52 people across 20 industries. They wanted to hear what the results of this were, this research. So we were invited, myself and two other co-authors, to start speaking publicly about this stuff. And I found, indeed, that I enjoyed speaking engagements. I had fun on stage, and that was a surprise. Of course, I was nervous in the beginning, but I kind of figured out techniques to make it so that I was comfortable by knowing all the material in my head and having good notes and all of that kind of thing. And then I just started having fun on stage. So that was a really great thing to learn about, that I liked doing public speaking. The second book, which was on chief executive development, really established my expertise in CEOs and CEO development. And I did that at a relatively young age. So by then, I think I was around 40 or something like that, or just over 40. And that was incredibly helpful because that meant for people that I knew about this topic. And so I started to get more and more CEO clients, which was fantastic because they're a really interesting group of people to work with. The second thing I would say that are kind of significant milestones for me is that I had, in a couple of companies in particular, I had extraordinary colleagues. I worked at a place called the Change Partnership in the late 90s, early noughties, that was peopled by 9 other directors plus me, all of whom were male, on average 20 years older than me. And most of them had been FTSE 100 directors previous to this. So it was an incredible body of knowledge. And I was just soaking up the learning from these guys. And, I brought the kind of diversity in terms of being female and being younger. I was the first non-British person as well. So I had these kind of odd American views on things, but they were very welcoming. And I learned a lot about consultative selling and being a consultant in this area in a professional way. I then worked for a place called Delta, or Mercer Delta Consulting, which was at the time the #1 change consulting business in the world to Fortune 500 CEOs. And that really, again, I had extraordinary people as colleagues who were often the guru in their area about a specific area of leading change. And, working around them and studying with them was like being kind of doing a mini MBA program. It was just amazing. And they were, in both places, generous spirited people to work with. And it was just an exceptional learning time for my life in terms of my colleagues. The third thing I would say is that I've had the pleasure of doing several kind of groundbreaking large-scale change consulting projects. I did a big one designed and then co-led with the UK Civil Service, which lasted 6 years. And I co-designed it and then started and led it for the first year. And then I was headhunted away to Delta. But that was to double the number of ethnic minorities in the senior civil service. And they gave us 5 years to do it. We did it in 2. That was a really exceptional experience of introducing lots of new things that they hadn't done before, a kind of multi-pronged approach to development, very intensive development, big assessment program along with it that we did. And that really taught me a lot. It was a historic and kind of has had long-lasting impact. So some of the big ethnic minorities who are in senior positions of government today went through that program. I had a similar shorter kind of 2-year program with Citigroup, had started in EMEA and then was really successful and was rolled into North America. And then probably the one I'm most proud of is I worked with a company in the Emirates, ADNOC, the largest of the companies with about 50,000 employees, where I helped to move women into chief executive roles for the first time in history. And it was a big historic win, not only for the company, but also for the region, because in the industry, there had not been any women CEOs in the region, and also the country hadn't experienced that either. So it was a really big, important, groundbreaking, and challenging program. Again, multi-pronged. So those things I learned a huge amount from, because all three of them in different cultures. At the time I was living in the UK, so I was learning about UK culture, but I'm from New York. So Citigroup has a much more US culture, and obviously ADNOC has an Emirati culture.
Cool. That's really nice. I mean, oftentimes I'm seeing companies also struggle, right, with the whole concept of they need more women in leadership positions, but they don't know how to do it. So I believe what you are doing is actually essential also for these companies, right? But now moving on. So first, let's talk about what is CEO succession, because that's the whole point, right? Like, what is CEO succession? If I were to explain it to someone who's running a business but has no clue that there is something called CEO succession.
Basically, if you're running a medium or large company, it's not as essential in a small company, but it's very, very essential in a medium and a large size company. You have a lot of weight of the success of the company that is sitting on the shoulders of the CEO, partially because, as I said, they're the primary people who are connecting with the outside world and to kind of critical stakeholders. But if you do not have a succession plan in place, and you're not kind of actively preparing people for that, if something happens to the CEO, it's very, very risky for the business. It's destabilizing. It can have a massive impact on the share price. It can even put it into a situation where a business that wasn't a kind of potential target for takeover can suddenly look like an attractive prospect because it's unstable and so on. So it is a crucial thing to do. And it's something which is really interesting because it's, I would say, the most highly political thing that happens in a company at a kind of involving only a few people. Of course, if you have a kind of merger or an acquisition of a kind of equal sized business, that's another major, very political thing that happens. But in terms of not doing something like that, it's the singular most important and highly charged political thing that happens in a business. So it's dangerous. It's got a lot of risk. So it's got to be managed thoughtfully and carefully to do it well.
Mm-hmm. And behind this, I believe there's a lot of planning going on. So why is succession planning actually critical for long-term success? For example, you mentioned now the share price might fall down, right? So I assume we are talking about companies that are only on the stock market.
No, it's not only them. Honestly, it should be every company sort of thinking about succession issues. But there's a very big danger of people in the most senior role and those around them thinking, oh, this person is the only person on earth who can do this job. It's pretty much never the case that that's the only person who can do the job. But there's a kind of fantasy about that which can spread and be believed by a lot of people. And you have to, it's your job, if you're the chair of a big company or if you're the CEO of perhaps even your own company, to be thinking about, when I need to step away, or God forbid something happens and I fall under a bus, I have to step away. Who's going to step in and stabilize the company and lead it to the next chapter, through the next chapter? That you have to be thinking about that for the longevity and the health of the business itself. So it requires a kind of a focus on the good of the whole, not the good of me personally, but the good of the whole. And, what I would say is that if you're thinking about like a FTSE listed or a kind of Fortune 500 kind of listed companies, the chairs of those companies are responsible legally for finding a successor. And they are legally responsible for the process of prepping the successor potentials. So they're often not going to have just one person because, again, that's high risk. It's putting too much eggs in one basket. So usually what CEOs do is that they will look at the top contenders, maybe 2 or 3 people at the top of an organization who look like maybe in a few years they could do this job. And then they start developing them. But in addition, they will have usually in parallel a a plan to go to the marketplace to sort of benchmark. So it's almost like they're going to give their own people a couple of years, let's say, to grow in all the ways you need to grow to be able to become a successful chief executive and have a smooth transition. And simultaneously, at sort of toward the end of that, in the last 6 months of it or so, they're going to actually get a search firm involved. And then they're going to do an international search so that they can benchmark their own people internally against those external candidates and then make some decisions. Because sometimes it makes most sense for stability to have an internal person if you can. But sometimes the people inside are not really ready for the kinds of challenges that are coming up. And then you have to go external. But it's, the good chairman is actually giving a 2-year window, I would say, for people to prepare. And the window is a very important thing, because once you press the button on we're looking at successors, you start to destabilize the current CEO, because the current CEO now has a death sentence. And he or she is thinking, okay, what am I going to do in 2 years' time? And if you're talking about really big companies, this is probably the biggest job he or she will ever have. The most status, the most money they're ever going to have. They get invited to all the big parties. Everybody wants to see them. They're kind of like a big man or woman about town. So when their colleagues begin to go through the process of getting developed, they usually feel pretty relaxed. Oh, she couldn't do the job. Oh, he couldn't do the job. They're quite relaxed because it's like, I've been doing the job. I know how to do the job. The board is happy with me. The shareholders are happy with me. These guys can't touch me. And then as I start doing my job of working with a successor, quarter by quarter, they're looking better and better. They're looking more and more credible. And that is where the problems begin. Because then the incumbent CEO starts getting nervous and oftentimes starts creating problems. So I'll kind of leave it there on that little, that plane.
No, I remember I know someone who runs a really small business, not super big. My friend's father was running it. He wanted to give his son the business. And now there we are talking about a father and son. Now, the father was so reluctant in handing over the business. He was still afterwards, he gave him the business, run the business. I'm out. I am retired. I'm not going to annoy you. You take the decisions. You call the shots. But it was he was every single day in the office. Hey, you need to do this like this. This is not how you do it. This is not how you do it. I mean, the son was doing a good job. It took him some time because he was not very experienced. I would say 7, 8 years experienced in the same company. And then, he couldn't match up with his father, but he still did. When he took over the CEO, like you said, it takes time. And eventually he started growing it really nicely and growing it in a manner which was also considering the new tech era.
Exactly.
The whole AI and stuff, because things are changing really fast, right?
Yeah.
So now, which brings me to my question about qualities and skills that you basically look for in potential CEO successors, because I believe there are a lot of things you need to make sure, right?
Yes. There's a lot of skills. If you have ever seen a kind of job spec from a headhunter or a search consultant about a CEO job, the list is about 20 characteristics long. It's big. It's a big list, and I'm not going to do that whole thing, but I thought I'd give you 5. So the first one, which is a very obvious one, but needs to be said, is that the person has natural qualities of leadership. And by that, I mean something really simple, like people want to follow them, right? And you might say, well, of course, Liz, that's the case. It's not so obvious, because many times what happens in organizations is that the person who's the best technical person at a specific thing and maybe making the most money from that technical thing gets offered the job of being a leader. But being a technically knowledgeable and capable person is not the same thing as leading people. And often they don't have the combination of the skills. So being a natural leader is a really important thing. Even if you're a little bit of a natural leader, that can be built upon, but you have to have some ability to have people following you. Creating followership is what they call it in my business. Of course, they have to have a technical knowledge of whatever the company does, the product base, They need to have industry experience more broadly that's relevant. They have to have geographical experience that's relevant, and kind of, because you don't want to kind of airdrop somebody from halfway across the world in, even if they have the right capability, to a culture they don't understand, where they don't speak the language, where they are going to make lots and lots of problems at senior levels without trying to, because they don't understand the codes of the culture at the top. So you need all of that stuff. And then what I said before, they need to have a big picture vision and a big picture view. And this is a really interesting one, because you have to be able to inspire the people in the organization. And if you've come up, let's say you're an internal hire, and you're getting promoted up from a job like CFO, which is a very typical kind of movement up. You've had a job which is super focused on the detail, an operations director, super focused on the detail. Now you have to have a strategic view of the whole marketplace, of where you're going to put yourself, where you're going to be competitive, what you're going to stop doing, what you're going to start doing. And that is not natural for a lot of people who have really detailed jobs. So if you find that you're one of those people who's been promoted into that role and you don't have that natural skill, you have to hire somebody who's going to work super closely with you, who can give you that. And that could be a strategic consultant who's external, but it also could be an internal person that you can rely upon who's got that skill base. So that's a kind of crucial one, because if you have an organization that doesn't have a vision and a strategy that's going to get you to that vision, it becomes dull for the people that are working inside it. So you have to have that. It also ensures survival, right? So your point about making sure that you understand the newest tech and you're going to bring that in and all of that stuff. Otherwise, you're left behind. The fourth thing that I would say is strategic influencing skills. As I said before, McKinsey's research says 60% of a CEO's job is strategic influencing. I would say 60 to 80%, depending upon what's going on. If you have any kind of drama or trouble that's going on in the news or with the share price, you're going to be doing a lot more phone calls. You're going to be doing a lot more TV appearances, a lot more conversations with investors. So it can be 100% of your time sometimes. And then you have to be able to lead change. And leading change means you have to inspire people through discussions. So you have to be a good public speaker. You have to have either good speech writers around you or write a good speech yourself, and then deliver it with optimism, encouragement, energy, to be motivating to the people that are actually below you. So I'll keep it to those five.
I'm just thinking about the 60 to 80% of the time that you mentioned about on strategic influencing. How does this particular skill, strategic influencing, actually impact organizational success? Or you mentioned the example of where they're on phone calls when the share price, let's say, takes a dip, or something happens.
I'll give you an example of this, but I'm working with an organization at the moment where they, which is a FTSE like 10 or 12. So it's a really big organization. And they recently had some underperformance compared to what their projections were. And so the investor community went a bit crazy. And they had to then really do roadshows, saying basically, because the investors are like, hang on a second, you've just shocked us with this. Now you're telling us we're not going to get dividends. Now you're telling us it's like a bad news story. How are you going to fix this? And how quickly is that going to happen? That's the kind of question from the investor community. So they have to, first of all, come up with a credible plan to fix it. And then usually the finance director and the CEO go out on the road and start talking to investors in different countries, and starting with the largest ones and the most critical ones, to calm them down. And sometimes they do roadshows, big ones. Sometimes they do one-to-one meetings with really senior people who have a lot of influence on what's going on. So, but that's like, then, I was talking to the CEO of that organization about a month ago, who just finished one of those. It took 6 weeks, and it was a round the world tour. That's like a full-time job for 6 weeks. So, they calmed down the nervousness in the marketplace and the kind of volatility in share exchanges, and calm people down, and started to kind of put in place and it's one of those things now, okay, now we're going to get step by step. We're going to kind of get back to where we were supposed to be. But that's a kind of thing where that's not an unusual thing to happen in a CEO's life.
You mentioned about this whole strategic influencing. Imagine a CEO is like getting on a jet, traveling around, making sure the market stays calm. And then suddenly the topic comes up, hey, you know what, we are thinking of CEO succession, or the time is now. And the CEO panics, or is like you mentioned, incumbent CEO. You know, he takes the toll. But I'm sure there are certain steps, you know, that you take care of that ensures a smooth transition during CEO succession. I mean, some people also want to retire early. I mean, that's also fine, right? Some people I know, as a matter of fact, in my network, are like, by 45 we are done, we don't want a full-time job. You know, I have those kind of people as well in my network, which is fine.
Absolutely. But I guess what I would say is, if your ambition is to be running one of the top 100 companies in your country, you're not going to want to retire at 45. Do you know what I mean? So these people that I'm working with are driven, and this has been the ambition of their lives, and they now have the dream job, and they are getting invited to, you know, every kind of fancy party that you can imagine, from Davos to the, you know, meeting with royals and the biggest investors in the world. And, you know, it's very glamorous. And so the concept of actually sort of saying goodbye to all of that is super hard. And most of the time they don't have to think about it. But when they have a CEO successor that looks like they're gaining ground with the skills and so on, it starts making them very nervous. But, you know, if you know, is the question really kind of, how do you make a smooth transition for that? I mean, I think, you know, you have to actually, what I have to do is I have to build the skills and the mindset of the person who's a successor for enterprise leadership, because usually what they've done is they've been running a big part of a larger company, but now they have to get the bigger view of the group, and they have to understand how all of that stuff works together. So they have to start having job experiences that give them sight over all of that stuff. One of the critical things that people really don't tell you about is that you have to prioritize your time ruthlessly. And you have to think about, what is it that I and only I can do, and give everything else away. So a lot of that senior stakeholder management is stuff that only you can do, because, you know, the head of the regulation group is only going to want to talk to you. The person who's the government head of policy on such and such only wants to talk to you. So there are things that only you can do. Many of the senior investors, they don't want to talk to somebody else. It's like, even, yes, they'll talk to the CFO because the person has the detail, but they want the big cheese because that person has the ability to make change. So prioritizing your time is massively challenging for a lot of these people, because they've come up through a job where they were doing a lot more, and now they have to stop doing a lot of that stuff and actually focus more on the influencing side and the creating the vision and going around and kind of energizing people about let's get there together and all of that stuff. So prioritization is critical, and delegation. And I often have to work quite a lot with people in the succession development piece on that. Strategic influencing for a CEO successor focuses initially on the chief executive, who's often involved in the decision-making about who's next, the chair, who's the primary person who's responsible for that in a large company, and the board members. Many times an individual coming up has had very minimal contact, or sometimes no contact, with the board. And so getting to know the board members so that they feel they know who you are, what your values are. Do they trust you as a leader? Do they think you can actually make the jump? And then to watch you as you develop so that they gain more confidence. Yeah, this is the one. Mm-hmm. So those are critical. You have to also get in front of the investor community so that they feel at ease with you. And of course, you can't upstage the big cheese who is the current CEO. The media, equally, you need experience of doing that. As you are aware, the media can be a tricky kind of animal and sometimes trying to trip you up. And you need to be able to understand how to get your message across in a way that is professional and calm, no matter what the circumstances. And then, of course, they need to influence the senior executives. Mostly below the senior executive level, their own direct reports are going to be doing that work, but they have to be working very, very capably with that population.
Mm-hmm.
And then the biggest thing of all, of course, is that the CEO incumbent has to be ready to transition. And this is the trickiest part of any major transition period, as you were describing with your friend, whose dad kind of like came into work every day after he was no longer the CEO. Because this is a big job to give up. Many times people think in the beginning, oh yeah, that's fine, I'm ready for this. But as they get closer and as they begin to realize people can really do this job, gosh, I'm not the only person on the earth that can actually do this job. They then need to have something luring them away. That might be retirement. That might be, I want to take a trip around the world. I want to go to the golf course. I want to write a book. I want to start a portfolio career where I'm chair of one business and, on the board of several others. It can be many different things. It can be anything, really. I want to spend more time with my grandchildren or my wife who's unwell or whatever it is, right? So, but if they don't have a reason to leave, you're going to get trouble. And I've seen lots of trouble in these situations. Even in the best companies, there's trouble. So that piece of it for me and the CEO successor, for the chair, and for oftentimes an HR, group HR director is somewhat involved in the process too. This is the biggest challenge to navigate that piece of it. So, and then the other thing is about building a strategic vision, because the board, of course, wants to know what your strategic vision is, but the incumbent CEO does not want any challenge to his or her vision. So you have to build it and you have to talk about it in front of the board members. And by the time you're thinking about it, your brain is going, oh, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. And you start planning it. And then you have to kind of keep your mouth shut for whatever period of time until you're actually in the seat. Mm. And so it's a kind of interesting period. It's not an easy transition to make. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. And the biggest one that goes wrong most is the CEO that's already in the position makes it impossible, makes trouble, pushes the other person out. It's really something. It's like this is where you see the Machiavellian activity.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I can visualize so many things going wrong with the whole CEO succession, right? But I would love to hear maybe an example of where actually it was a challenging, even maybe went wrong with the whole CEO succession.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a lot.
Luckily, I had a couple of experiences early when I started doing this about 25 years ago. I started doing succession work, and this happened, and it was quite something. And so I won't name the company, but just to say this was an organization that was a major utility in the UK, and I was working with a successor to the CEO. And again, in the beginning, the group CEO was completely at ease with everything. And then, like, as the person got better and better in a visible way, he started getting nervous. At the same time, the organization was selling itself to a larger entity. What happened was that, as the incumbent CEO started to get more nervous, he went to the chair and he said to the chair, part of the way through the sale, if you don't fire that guy, who was his potential successor that I was working with, I'm going to expose you to the people acquiring us. And I'm going to tell them all the things that you've kind of like hidden in the closet and like all the bad stuff. I'm going to show them the skeletons. And, so I want you as chairman to fire this guy. So that's what happened. The chairman fired the guy who was the successor that I was working with, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because I and he had done everything right. It's quite something. That was an alarming experience. It was the first time it happened, and I learned a lot from it. But that was a real shock to experience. I hadn't thought people would go to those kind of lengths, but it's kind of like people's identities are under threat in these situations, and that's what I began to understand back then when I was a naive young thing all those years ago.
I mean, it's also what you mentioned, right, about the luxury, for example, traveling first class, private jets, like fancy lifestyles. The salary is extremely high, so it all would make sense. I mean, and I have realized, like, I remember one of my mentors was always telling me, Majid, whenever you're a leader, like, remember one thing: you would have someone in your team who's trying to destroy you. And that was the first time I became a manager, and I went to him for advice, and he was like, "Man, remember one thing: there would be always someone who will try to destroy you." And that was so true, because there was someone in the team who was just going around spreading rumors. Yeah, something bad always. And I never did anything bad to them. And once they realized that they had no shot, they left the company themselves. They were like, they got the shot somewhere else. They went there then, and I was really surprised, of what happened.
Yeah, people are competitive, and many people are willing to do underhanded things
Mhm.
to get ahead. So yeah, that was a good piece of advice.
Yeah, I mean, that time I was a little confused because I was super young. I was super, super young. I was like, why would someone want my job? I mean, if they wanted, they could have applied and taken it, right? I mean, they had a process and everything, but he said, no, there are people who will never apply, but they don't want you to be on the leadership seat. So that's fine. I'm like, okay, cool. But now coming back to this, because there's a topic I also have like a lot of interest in, the whole point of strategic influencing. So, in your opinion, or in your experience, what have you seen that what should organizations actually look for when identifying potential leaders with strong strategic influencing abilities?
Yes, well, I'm going to quote the guru here, which is a guy called Dr. Joel DeLuca. And Joel started a piece of research in 1974, which ran for 20 years longitudinally with 11,000 people. I think it's probably the largest piece of research that's ever been done. And he had been a PhD physicist, so he brought that kind of scientific rigor to this study. He was working with 9 multinational companies, so he kind of got a really interesting perspective on it. What he found in his research was that the people who are good at this, they have built deep and wide relationships with a lot of people across, many different spheres that are related to their work or family or whatever. And they look to understand where there are trusted relationships in their work situations, and they leverage those to do strategic influencing. They also, to be able to do this, there's a kind of general rule about humans, which I know from doing a lot of change leadership work, which is that humans resist change. And you have to have a reason to change. And so when you're influencing somebody, you have to be thinking about, why is this person going to do something as uncomfortable as making this change? What's the incentive for him or her? And and how does that align with what I want to try to do? So it's basically the qualities people should be looking for is, do these people have deep and wide trusted relationships in the company, in the industry? And then secondly, are they strategic in the way they leverage those? Because the research that Joel did showed that the best possible way to influence people is leveraging a high trust relationship, have a one-to-one conversation, not a 3-to-1 or a 2-to-1, a one-to-one conversationship in an informal setting. You have the highest chances of success of influencing somebody with those circumstances, having thought through, why is Majid going to make a change to do what I want to do? And then also that they are leveraging these ethically. So it's kind of lots of trusted relationships, in relevant places for us, strategically leveraging the skills and doing it in an ethical way. So those are the kind of critical things to be looking for.
So recently I stumbled upon me and my friends, because this is one of the things we talk about all the time: work, office, bosses, C-level. That's what we talk about, like, because we are friends, we talk about it. And one of my friends was, hey Majid, so he's like a principal software engineer. It's individual contributor level 5, I think, or some companies it's like 6. And he was brought upon by the whole C-suite, like CTO, CPO, COO, CMO, CEO. and they basically tried to like crush him with like asking him for input. And he said, Majid, was this strategic influencing? I was like, I don't think so. It felt more like they don't want you. What do you think about something? Because that's super, super common in IT organizations, especially these startups where people become leaders at a young age.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the situation?
The situation was the guy was working on a project, implementing something. He's responsible for not no people, so but he's responsible for helping someone who's a junior resource. If they are stuck, hey, this is how you solve a problem. This is how you do this, but not responsible as a manager or a direct report. And then he was summoned by the C level, because the C level I felt was too micromanaging. Because this, I mean, between the C level and him, the hierarchy was there's a senior VP, then there's a VP, then there's a director, and then there's a head, and then there's a team lead. This much of a difference, and the C level basically summoned him, and I was questioning like why are they interested? And when he told me the content of the meeting, the content was, hey, what have you delivered in the last 2 weeks?
Well, I think a lot depends upon the tone, because if he's delivered a lot in the last 2 weeks, that person has heard about him in a good light and wants to hear, who is this guy? He wants to kind of like see the whites of that guy's eyes, right? So, but if it's kind of in an accusatory tone, then he's heard bad stuff and he's trying to determine what's the value of this guy in my business.
Mm.
You know, that's what I would say. But I don't know what the tone was in that.
So,
does he have good relationships with these? I mean, it's crazy that there's like 5 other layers between him and this man. But anyway, does he have a good relationship with the people above him?
he says, I never talked with them because I was always talking with my lead, which makes sense. Or maybe one level above his lead, presenting and so
Okay.
on. And then suddenly he said it was weird because the company has a super short tenure of employees. The retention rate of employees is really low, really bad. And they are always comparing like, hey, we are not someone like Siemens, or we are not someone like, the old school companies which have a super, super long retention rate. And then I was like, I don't know what to say, because this doesn't feel like appreciation for me. I mean, appreciation,
Yeah.
you can do it in a message, in an email. Like we have all these town hall meetings and so on.
Well, I mean, I think as I hear more about it, it sounds to me like he has not developed enough relationships of trust with the people above him to give him protection. If you're focusing just down and on the job, you're not going to stay long in a company unless you're like the best person in the world who does whatever that technical thing is. You're not going to stay long, because people like to know that they have a relationship with other people, and they have to want to be able to have trust. So it is part of, it's like what I started with, really, developing good skills in strategic influencing is based upon relationships of trust. And, oftentimes not just trust down into the team, but trust up and trust sideways as well. So you have to be building trust in those directions to be able to kind of safeguard your position, because then you also hear what's going on around you. Like this coming out of the blue is a bad sign.
But this is still important, right? I mean, this guy is like part of an organization with 8,000-9,000 employees. It's just one of the few peoples, right? So, which brings me to my next question, which is, what practical strategies can actually executives, or anyone, as a matter of fact, for example, this guy who's a principal software engineer, actually use to effectively influence or build relations with the key stakeholders and drive the whole organizational
Yeah.
goal?
I think in some kinds of business, the short answer is build relationships with humans. In certain kinds of businesses, like let's say banks, if you're kind of in the middle ranks or the top ranks, people are spending a lot of time with each other, building those relationships, building relationships of trust, understanding who are these people. Part of the danger for young people is that they think if they're technically good at something, that's going to be enough. And it's really not. I mean, unless you are the only person on earth who can do something, you're replaceable. And, if people want to work with you, they're going to give you leeway. If they don't want to work with you because you hide away in a cave or whatever, even if you produce good work, they don't want you around because you're not fun to have a pizza with or whatever on a Friday night. So part of this is actually about the importance of building relationship, because relationship and trust give you the foundation for being able to influence people. So the job is not just the technical thing that you got trained in and that you do as the kind of paid job. The job is also about building relationships up, down, sideways, and out, by the way, as well. I was once working in the early noughties with somebody who was a female senior leader, managing director level person at Goldman Sachs. And back in those days, her computer was malfunctioning. And so the IT guy said, oh, your colleague down the hall, such and such man, is away this week. Why don't you use his? So she kind of opened up his, and she saw that every day for 1 hour, 5 days a week, in the middle of the day, around lunchtime, he had networking as like what he did every single week, 1 hour a day. And she was, of course, the mother of a child who was relatively young. And so she'd get through her work as quickly as she can. And then she'd race home to try to see her child before he had bath time and so on. She was kind of like in that mentality. And she had this eureka moment of, this guy is getting a lot more projects funded than I am. And here's why. He's spending time with colleagues. And he's networking internally in the business every single day for an hour. Mm-hmm. Like, wow. So I think for people to recognize when they, once they finish their professional training, it's about building relationships. And then, yes, of course, doing the technical stuff that you have to do. But if you don't have relationships with people, you're not going to people don't want you around. You're not fun to be with. We don't want you around unless we have to have you around.
That's true. And now, thanks to ChatGPT and the whole AI, a lot of jobs can be replaced really easily, even in IT. Like I can give you an example. I built a software within 3 hours that would normally take me approximately 4 months of work with a full-blown team. 3 hours, and it was working perfectly fine. And I showed my friend who runs a software house. I was like, dude, here you go. I built the whole thing. And we had we were just having, it was like a challenge. He got a customer, and I was like, dude, I can do it in less than 4 hours. He's like, no, dude, my team gave me a quote of 3 months. I'm like, no, I would do it in another manner, but it's going to have the same output, maybe even more efficient than what your team will come up with. And it was a fully automated system. So basically, the customer would only need salespeople. Everything else was automated. Everything else so. But which brings me to, because we're also coming towards an end, but there are two things that I would still love to ask you. One is about, we looked at now from the bottom up, like how can a person build a relationship towards up, but how, in your opinion, can a CEO or any executive maintain their influence also in a rapidly changing business environment?
Yeah, I thought I would give you sort of two examples of this. So I was working a while ago with a guy who was the CEO of a FTSE 100 bank. And this is a person who not only is charming and very easy, makes relationships, but is very knowledgeable, so kind of inspires credibility and trust in people as well. And he had a perspective that the regulator was a really important group to get close to for the purpose of actually letting them know, I'm looking at risk in my organization. I'm managing that risk really tightly. And I'm going to anticipate problems that might have relevance for you. And I'm going to come to you when I've got that information, A, to let you know in advance that that's happening, and B, to tell you what we're doing to manage it. Mm. The regulators absolutely adored him as a result of that. Now, I'm not saying they gave him special favors or anything like that, but that is a kind of typical reason of why CEOs should be, building those relationships of trust with people that have high impact in their industries. And in particular, most people with regulators stay as far away as they possibly can and try to hide from them. And so only, almost like waiting for the knock on the door with like fear and trepidation. Much better to be out in front of it, in his view, build those relationships of trust and say, hey, listen, we see what your issues are. We're concerned about that too. We're looking for this. We've got a potential problem. We're trying to manage it, so that they kind of like they're making a smooth path for themselves. And what it means is, if a problem arises, they're going to get a much more sympathetic and kind of listening to that. It doesn't mean they're going to be getting special favors, as I say, but people are going to be more empathetic and trying to help them figure it out. And just to kind of give you an example of another guy that I worked with, who is the CEO of a very dynamic CEO of an aerospace company. He came in to the organization. He's a very kind of energetic guy and a very optimistic guy, but he knows his stuff. He knows his stuff operationally, come out of an operations role. And he was very friendly, widely respected, had, built relationships in the whole industry, came in, really had to do a turnaround of culture as well as performance of the business. And within 4 years, he basically doubled the value of the organization without any acquisitions at all. And, completely changed the culture from within with help from external consultants to do that, to make it a very high performing organization that was dynamic, very fast paced, where there was people were happier going into work, and they were producing a lot more. So, he outperformed the kind of FTSE index by about 16 to 1. And he moved the organization in the FTSE rankings. And then 4 years after he arrived, sold the organization to a larger organization for literally twice what it was as value when he first walked in 4 years ago. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. That's a guy who is navigating the relationships at every single level, internally, externally, direct reports down to the kind of like walking the shop floor, everything. Amazing. Mm-hmm. And one final, if you can cope with it, one final example of a person that I think is the most natural at this. I was working with a Greek shipping company, and the guy who had started this company was a very naturally charismatic personality, and he loved people and people loved him. He was just like a really great guy, and everybody loved hanging around him. He would walk the shop floor. He'd go to where the ships were being built or being fixed, and he'd walk his own kind of office, and he'd be on the phone all day. So he would be talking to 70 people in his company internally every single day. So this is a guy who had his finger on the pulse of everything. People loved him. They'd go the extra mile for him, but he was hearing everything that was going on in the organization, from the shop floor all the way up to, the direct reports as well. Mm-hmm. And he retired and gave the business to his son. So one of these situations, coming back to your point, and I always felt sorry, because his son was a really dynamic guy too, but it's extremely difficult to compete with that.
No, that's I cannot imagine. It's probably really hard, really, really hard. But one final question would be that, what would be the single piece of advice that you would give actually the executives of today, because you have seen the industry change so much, like over the past since 90s things have evolved. 1999 there was this whole dot-com bubble, and then we had more changes than the financial crisis. You have seen a lot of things. So what would be the one advice that you would like to give to the executives of today and the future?
Yeah, I think that this is a unique kind of moment in history, in the sense that we have a range of technologies that are transforming our lives and definitely business, as you were mentioning before. And I think that a CEO has to, on one hand, stay current. So they have to take up the new technology. They can't just avoid the new technologies. They have to take up and trial new technologies to see, could this help our business? Could this help our business? Because there's so many different ones. There's AI that you've mentioned, but there's machine learning, there's robotics, there's a whole host of things that are kind of around right now. And you have to embrace it. But my caution is, don't ignore it, but don't embrace it fully, because you need to be clear about what are the things that our talent can do better that the tech can't do. And what's the combination of the tech and the talent that's going to really optimize things for the business and for our customer base? That's what I would say, because you can't ignore it. You have to kind of face into it, even though sometimes it's difficult to do that. And then you have to trial things, experiment with things, and really be clear, what are humans better at doing than this? And how can we actually get things to work together, both human and the tech, in a way that's going to give us the best possible outcomes? And then that is going to evolve and evolve and evolve as time goes on. But that's the single most important thing, because otherwise you're going to become obsolete really fast.
That's very true, especially considering how much technology has evolved over the last 2, 3, maybe 4 years. Like now, technology is evolving really, really fast. I'm attending a conference, or maybe I would have already attended the conference, and I saw some of the tech gadgets that are coming for home. I was pretty surprised, like with the whole thing. I mean, I'm talking about, I attended it last year, 2023, and now I'm attending it again, 2024, and the evolvement is massive. I mean, so, but thank you so much for joining today, Liz. It was really, really different, to say the least. It was really interesting because I never thought about this whole CEO succession. I mean, I had the honor of running a business last year as well, and it was it was fun for sure. It was very challenging as well. Sometimes people come with different problems. Listening today to everything you had to share was really, really insightful and actually very inspiring as well. But is there something you would like to say as a general closing remark?
Well, I mean, I think I've said a lot, to be honest with you, but I'm really pleased to have been invited to come along today. So I appreciate that, and also to talk about this subject, because, as you say, it's not really widely written about or even spoken about, because it's a very small number of people at the top of organizations that are actually involved in it, and it's usually highly confidential. So it's a pleasure for me to talk about, because I've kind of lived through the ups and downs of it, and I'm grateful to somebody giving me the opportunity to talk about it. It's because I'm passionate about it. I do a lot of this work, and so it's really fun work, but it's like a high wire act at certain points.
Thank you once again. It was very helpful. So to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to the executives this week. If you found this episode valuable, don't forget to subscribe, share, or comment with your network. And if you want to connect with Liz, her information would be mentioned, her company website would be mentioned on the description. Until next time, this is Majid signing off.